My name is Dario. Been in startups for about 15 years in some way, shape, or form. I co-founded Invoke, Hootsuite, and now I'm working on something called Quietly, just wondering what that might be. It's a network for sharing personal recommendations. It amplifies content distribution. It's great for content marketing, and it monitors reach, influence, and engagement. I recently took the company on a world tour. We did 17 cities in 14 countries over 3 months, and I learned a lot about foreign markets. So what I was doing on this trip was meeting with entrepreneurs, meeting with VCs, meeting with media organizations, meeting with co-working facilities, and really getting an understanding of the climate for startups globally, what the markets look like, what types of companies exist there, and for what reasons those types of companies exist. And so I really just want to share this with you because I think a lot of people aren't quite thinking in this manner. In fact, one of the VCs that I raised some money from, he says that he always asks every company that he's meeting with what their global perspective is or what their international strategy is. And he says that almost none of them have one. And so I've taken the opposite approach in that we're building this launch strategy globally first. So what this means, we're talking about growth. So I'm assuming that people here in the audience have a startup, otherwise you wouldn't be sitting here. And there's a lot of factors that enable you to realize a success of some sorts. So what I want to talk about is growth and increasing its potential. So a lot of people use the term growth hacking, and a lot of people think that's obnoxious. I'm one of those people who think that term is obnoxious, but regardless, what we're talking about is straight up user acquisition and how it appeals to how various groups of users appeal to your product, or your product appeals to them. So, what about the product? So this is where we're talking about product and growth intersecting. So I'm going to assume that you have a product that some people are interested in and something that's interesting and that's high quality. So what I want to know is, in whose eyes is this important? So there's different people all over the world, and some products fail in some markets and some succeed in others. And so what we want to do is we want to leverage as many markets as possible in order to determine what success looks like. So is the market in Jakarta less important than in Berlin, or Bogota, or Los Angeles? Is your startup a failure because you have 100,000 users in Bangkok, but only 10,000 in New York City? So by launching in a market like New York City and gauging success only in that market, say, or any other city in the world, you can live and die. You can, if I had 10,000 users in New York City, I would probably be getting ready to pack up, right? But if I can leverage foreign markets and understand what people are doing in those, then it's possible to create a success. So of course that's not a failure. What we're talking about is identifying an additional market, something new, an exciting opportunity for growth. And so taking this perspective helps tie in product development and growth. So it might be considered a failure, say, in New York City, but if you acquire 100,000 users in another city, or maybe 25,000 in Hong Kong, or something in Rome, you're identifying these new markets, and you can start to appeal to those users. So maybe you do need to do product tweaks in order to appeal to a group of users in the United States, but at least you have a perspective on where it is successful. So the idea is how to plan for this. You don't want a fluke situation. Time and time I've had people tell me about their products growing. They're like, well, we didn't realize this was happening. All of a sudden, we're big in Peru. This is really strange. So we started focusing on Peru. Another pretty well-known startup from the Bay didn't get traction anywhere except Vietnam. And then once they got traction in Vietnam, they realized that was a great market. They quickly began to localize, and then of course they started to grow in Southeast Asia, and they were able to apply those learnings to the market in the United States. So otherwise, if they hadn't realized and tailored to that market, they probably would have had to shut their doors. So what you want to do is actually engineer the growth and not wait for that fluke situation. engineer the growth in these in multiple markets simultaneously. And so this is actually pretty simple, and you're probably already doing it, but you're just not necessarily thinking on a grand enough scale. So the idea is to start with who. And this is, when I say you're probably already doing this, I mean, identifying the type of users who are getting the most value from your product is a no-brainer. I mean, who are your users? Are they travelers? Is it bloggers? Is it life hackers? Is it, you know, bus drivers? It doesn't really matter, right? The idea is you're identifying your market, but then what I'm saying is look for them globally, and find out who influences them. Make a gigantic list of these people, and then get to work. Just start reaching out. And the means that we found to work best is Twitter. Twitter is excellent because it's a public channel, and we used on this trip we used about 4 different accounts, some personal and some company based, to identify people and reach out. People want to have conversations. They want to talk about what they're doing, and so it's really easy to reach out in this way. So the idea is like, use these tools that you're already using in the local markets, apply them globally. You know, where do you find them? And the answer is literally everywhere. So of course you want adoption in the Bay Area. Everyone in the universe wants this. It's amazing. After this trip, people care less about America than they do about San Francisco. Every startup, every community of startups in the world, they're like San Francisco, San Francisco. It was mind blowing. So yeah, I mean, do you want penetration in San Francisco? Of course, or the United States. But how about this? Is a market like Moscow interesting, or Europe as a whole? These are gigantic populations, and of course, if you start to think even larger, you add China and India, and you're talking about, you know, a decent sized chunk of the entire planet. So the idea really is to create community, to expand your communication strategy. These are things, again, I can't repeat this enough. These are the things you're already doing. Just apply them outside, and go grassroots. So identifying your power users and embracing them and giving them things to do, keeping them in the loop, favored status, ambassador programs are really excellent. So we spent a bunch of time analyzing ambassador programs around the world as well, and there's several that do it really well. So Salesforce on the enterprise side, IM is a photo sharing application out of Berlin that became pretty good friends with the founders, and they have about 4 million users. I mean, you could consider them a competitor to something like an Instagram, but they have an amazing global ambassador program where people are organizing photo walks, they're organizing community events, and these people don't get paid. They get like stickers and things like that. So it's pretty easy to mobilize. Hootsuite, of course, has done a fantastic job with ambassadors all over the world. Uber as well. Every single city has an ambassador program. So the idea is if you mobilize these people on a global perspective, you're able to see where penetration can begin. And when do you start? So a Chinese proverb, this is a saying that I like quite a bit. Best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is right now. And so what this means is start right now. But before you even launch and you start identifying where people are coming from, who you want to be talking to, just take a global perspective. So what I want to do is the whole purpose of this is really just to get people thinking about this global perspective, and I want to get some people up here or talking about their startups and identifying some issues that they may have faced, whether you're talking about launching globally, whether you're talking about launching locally. But the idea is that we get in a conversation here. This is supposed to be a workshop, so I want to hear from everybody. Go ahead. Yeah, so there can be a lot of costs associated with doing this, but at the same time, there can be more costs with not doing it. So the idea is, if you seed a community, if you identify one, and you seed that with your product, it doesn't have to necessarily be in that local language, but you can start to understand how things are being used and what that community's needs are, and then you can address them, right? It's similar to getting product feedback. if 20,000 people are asking for a feature, then it might be pretty important. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to integrate that, but at least it's an indicator of what people want. And if it's pertaining to a geographic area, then you know to focus on that. So the idea is instead of stumbling upon a community, engineer the growth in every community. And it doesn't have to be localized. So with Quietly, we have it localized. We're building it to be able to be localized. And when we do our full-scale launch, it will probably be somewhere between 7 and 12 languages. We're working on what those are, but we know that it needs to be in many. But to plan to do that is not very costly. So translation services are very inexpensive now. With Hootsuite, we crowdsourced the translation efforts into like 15 languages. It was really effective. It was awesome. So for something like that, you actually are going to want some kind of critical mass. Like when Foursquare launched, they did it city by city because they didn't want some people in like Boise launching the application, seeing no one's there, and then closing it forever. And so in some cases, that does make sense, right? Whereas like Gowalla took the opposite approach. What they did is they launched everywhere, and then it was just a different philosophy. Yeah.
I think, hi, I'm Claude, and one of the best examples, I think, of Canada, what you're talking about, after Hootsuite, would probably be Wattpad. They just did a $17 million round now, Wattpad.
Yeah.
And I knew the founder and stuff like this. He worked for 4 years. Oh, does anybody know what Wattpad is? So, why don't you explain?
Wattpad is the largest free content website in the world. It's people writing stories for people. So
Yeah.
It's like a huge fan fiction site. It's fucking massive.
Yeah.
And it took off in Vietnam first.
In Vietnam.
In Vietnam and Philippines.
Yeah.
When we met, he'd been working 4 years before he got any funding. And then, but boom, it just exploded in the Philippines, Vietnam, everywhere else. Mm. But it's a self-book publishing thing now. So basically, it looks like crap when you write it out first, and it's like fan fiction.
Yeah.
And so, talk more about that, about what Wattpad did right and how they went about it.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know the story, man. So on this trip, I basically created an entire channel all around the world of people that I know each other, right? And so by launching into one community, I know that it's going to bleed into the others. And by doing them all simultaneously, I can at least create this ribbon, right? And you can do that remotely. You can do that via Twitter. You can do that via social media. But by creating this channel, you're leveraging a global community. So, Claude, what did you have anything else to add on that?
They've done a really good job. They're a perfect example of what you're
It is a perfect example. There's another company that I believe is based in Toronto, and they discovered that they had 3 times the amount of users, of their global users, basically were acquired in Jakarta. So they had 100,000 users acquired, and they're like, holy smokes, this just happened. Maybe we should check out these markets or whatever, right? It's a perfect example. As soon as I read that, it was actually an article in TechCrunch. When I read that, I was pretty, it was just interesting. It was because it was validating this kind of thinking. It's like, don't wait for those things to happen. Find some influencers in each city and try and tell your story and communicate with them. And if you do like a grassroots style, you can really, you can build traction pretty quickly.
Hi. If you're in a startup that requires international biz dev, do you have any thoughts about hiring Canadians versus hiring locals in those different countries to actually serve the customers?
I think that, it's going to depend. Do you need a certain level of local knowledge? I've been able to build a decent business in New York City by having people who are from Vancouver do business there, right? So it was remote, and then when I moved out to New York to grow the business, we brought a couple people over, and they did a pretty good job, and then we did hire some locals. So in that case, it's an either or. That's my experience. But in some cases, you're going to need, boots on the ground, local knowledge, and people with the abilities to execute and leverage their networks as well. That's that can be ultra critical, having personal networks in any given city. So it's I don't want to be wishy-washy, but it's a either or. It definitely depends. I've had success in both. Anybody else have some startup examples or something that they're considering doing for your own startups?
I guess I'm just, everything has a trade-off cost, right?
Yep.
So in my case, I have a significant trade-off cost. I'm like Uber in terms of trade-off cost. When I go to a city, it costs something.
Yep.
So there's something there where I have to figure out, okay, almost figure out the user base in each city before you even know what that user base is like.
Yep.
How do you decide, like you did your world tour, I knew about it already.
Yeah.
How did you decide where to go? How did you know what was worth visiting or trying and what wasn't?
Well, part of it was personal discovery. Part of it was just knowing where some hotspots are. Like it was obvious to check out Singapore because the government is pumping a lot of money into startups there. And what does that look like? It turns out that that's actually not the best way to kickstart things because it actually alienates future financing. So that can be a problem. Berlin, everyone has Berlin has a pretty big reputation for being a startup capital in Europe. So of course we wanted to check those out. But the idea is doing research on what your user base might be. So you can do some pretty detailed research before you enter a market. I mean, of course you would want to do that even before you launch your product in general. But it's easier and easier to do that. And really, I just think that the future is considering those. You can't just hunker down and launch Canada and the United States. I mean, if you're successful there, yes, you're successful. But you might, leveraging the global aspect is just smarter, in my opinion.
I think that one of the things we got to consider also is that not just the geographical aspect, but the verticals. Like people often think that it's going to be this vertical of business that's going to use your shit.
Yep.
And let's say in my case, it was like the first people who jumped on it were oil companies, like not at all who I thought was going to jump on it.
Yeah.
And there's a danger in that though, is that VCs will want you, as soon as you hit that kind of thing, some investors will want you to go only concentrate on that vertical.
Right.
And that's a tough guy. Like, what would you say to that if you're the entrepreneur, and suddenly, a vertical that's really, really specific. Like, if you look at oil people,
Yeah.
they don't even like to talk to non-oil people. I mean, it's very strict. Like, there's a whole oil philosophy thing going on. So it's like, it's true, man. Like, they did not like me, right? They paid me a lot of money, but the whole thing is, what would you say if your investors are saying, go after that vertical or go after that geographical location only? The one that catches on.
Well, if you're showing penetration in any given vertical, it makes sense to focus on that. It doesn't mean that you need to ignore everything else, but that's the whole idea, is identifying where users are and then tailoring it to that. I mean,
if it's a vertical, it affects your product design. Your future iterations will get better and better and better to serve, let's say, that vertical. It will. If you focus on one, let's say the oil vertical, you won't be able to work with like wind energy.
well, I mean, you tailor your marketing to energy in general. If it's oil, it's oil. If it's wind, it's wind. I mean, I'm just as an example. But, I mean, you would ignore that vertical at your apparel. I mean, maybe you will never be successful anywhere else, and maybe that is what you need to focus on. It's like the photo sharing that in Game Never Ending or whatever that became Flickr, right? I mean, it was a feature that everyone was using, so they deep sixed the rest and focused on photo sharing. It was an absolute transformation in the product.
Can I ask you more about Singapore?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Please,
so what's the
definitely.
deal? I got an email from some Singapore guys.
Yep.
And they're like, hi, we want to invest in you, but only if you're going to have significant infrastructure in Singapore soon.
Yeah.
And so I was like, well, I don't know. So can you please give me the idea on what the deal is with Singapore?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So Singapore's pretty interesting. It's a very small city. It's very risk adverse. The whole country, is a city. It's about 5 million people. And I met with probably 20 companies there in various stages, doing business from all over the world. And building a team in Singapore, I don't know that that's necessary at all. If you want to do business there, that's cool. But just like anywhere else, they want to attract talent, right? And they want to build this community. So I give them a lot of credit for being forward thinking, and it really goes against a lot of what the culture there states. They want safe jobs. It's like traditional jobs. It's finance. It's like accounting. It's very professional, and the culture of taking risks is not apparent. So, I mean, if you wanted to do business in Asia, it's pretty decent. It's very sterile in Singapore. I know a lot of companies do business in Singapore and Bangkok. They switch it up. So they have the chaos of Bangkok, and then they'll go to Singapore to cool out for a couple days, and then like, and they're like, well, this is fucking boring, and then they bounce back up to Bangkok where it's madness. I ran into a lot of people that did that, but I think that the climate in Singapore is decent. Like everywhere, everywhere in the world is behind the times in terms of relative to something like San Francisco. But there's no reason not to do business there. They're making things pretty accommodating. They have little tax breaks. They have infrastructure. So it's decent, but it's also not necessarily like a staging grounds. If you set up an office in Singapore, that doesn't necessarily mean you're easily going to enter into like Jakarta or the markets in Indonesia or Malaysia or whatever. You still need kind of boots on the ground in those aspects as well, but at least you're geographically located in that area. What did they? So they wanted Breather to potentially.
Yeah, they wanted Breather to be involved. So they just said we'll open a thing. And then nobody knows. Okay, I have a location-based company, so that's the only point. Is I'm involved in every city. So Breather was like, oh, they're like, you can go over there. We'll invest in your company if you open up a team there. So that's something interesting in terms of incentives. It might align the creation of other startup hubs. Can you maybe talk about other startup hubs and how, like, what are the other ones that you visited that are interesting, where people are early adopters or something?
So Berlin is a pretty big one. There's the city used to be very cheap to live in, and it's really strange actually. Berlin is, of course, a European capital, but it also has 25% unemployment. It's super strange. It's kind of like you took DC and Detroit and rammed them together. So a huge arts district there in East Germany, where it's really rather not pretty. It's not a pretty city, but the level of talent there is decent and it attracts people from all over Europe. Because it is inexpensive to live, but it's rising pretty rapidly. So it's becoming less and less inexpensive, or it's becoming more and more expensive. So Berlin is a good startup hub, but the money in Berlin comes from elsewhere. Most of it comes from London. I think London finances most of Europe in general for anything startup based. Amsterdam has a great community, but it's very disparate. So if the guys in Amsterdam cobbled together their various communities into one, it would be noteworthy. It's a great place to do business as an English-speaking human, and it's a very livable city. So I would consider Amsterdam pretty high on my list. Berlin in Europe, Singapore in Asia, Bangkok is a huge scene as well, and Thailand is actually quite a large market. The city is just enormous. It's like New York City, but hot and filthier than New York, amazingly. But it's a pretty good place to do business. I met a ton of people that were doing well. But again, it's access to capital is an issue. I raised money for Quietly in Los Angeles, and even there they're pretty risk adverse relative to something like San Francisco. So each place has its I guess charms and its pros and cons. Yeah.
So let's say you launch in Canada, US, and then you find out you have this really random pocket of super heavy users in South Africa.
Yep.
But you've already put so much of your time and effort in Canada, US, you already have things going on, and you see South Africa, and then you also see kind of like a blip in the UK, and you're like, oh, maybe that's kind of cool, and then maybe Singapore. It's like, if you're a one or a two-man shop, how do you focus? And like, when is that turning point where you decide that South Africa may be more worthwhile than, say, Canada?
Well, I think that you need to be testing the waters. Do turn your attention. If you're beating your head against the wall that is United States and Canada, and all of a sudden there's a window shows up, it might be nicer to put your head through that for a change, and take a look and focus on that at least partially. But at least you're acknowledging that there's an opportunity there, and I think that's critical. Is identifying the opportunity. You don't have to steer the entire ship over there, but take note, figure out what's going on, and identify why this pocket exists. Maybe it's a pocket of users that you had no idea of that type of user is interested in your product, and maybe that type of user also exists in the United States and Canada. And by tweaking what you're doing that you might unlock that whole niche or that user group within the place that you're doing business primarily. It's about recognizing opportunity, and if you. It's kind of like throwing spaghetti against the wall and seeing what stick. what sticks. If it sticks in 4 different places, like, go to work.
Run with it. Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else who's not Julian? What kind? Oh, quietly we'll launch this summer. Yeah, the tech is built. We're just working on the user interface right now. It had some challenges, so we need to put our best foot forward. Yeah.
I guess I kind of like take it back even, I guess kind of in the early stages. How would you, I've heard a lot of people kind of mention that, if you start globally right away, that's also an advantage. And then there's also kind of needing to kind of wait it out for a while and making sure you're viable and then going globally.
Yep.
I mean, what would your recommendation be out of your experience? I mean, is it really dependent, I guess, on the industry or?
Well, it definitely is. I mean, if there's hard costs, like in Julian's example with Breather, similar to Uber, there's a hard cost of going in and mobilizing
the
inventory. Yeah, it's similar to Uber in that it's using excess inventory in a different capacity. But the idea is that you need people on the ground, you need to mobilize, you need to create the inventory, and there's hard costs. So you need to do a lot of research before you enter a market. With what we're doing, it's a mobile application that is, it's geared around travelers to a certain extent, and so the whole nature is mobile, and it's very simple for us to take this global perspective. So it varies. You can't. I mean, when you're launching a startup, focus is absolutely critical. But again, what I'm talking about is the perspective of it. Your product might not be broken if you don't have massive adoption in the place that you're focusing on. So just use that perspective of thinking where these similar user types might exist, and then investigate and do it very inexpensively. I mean, it's not that difficult to reach out to people with Twitter and other social channels. It's literally like a tweet away. You can engage people, and people want to talk about what they're doing. So if you're talking about mobilizing any media types or users, if you're making their life easier and you have like a legitimate value proposition, they're going to want to talk to you because you're appealing to them. So it's pretty easy to reach out. It's very easy. Yeah, we had a huge list.
I think for a lot of people, defining, pigeonholing that user base, but that focus of driving down on who, that very specifically is scary because it's not everything to everybody. But being able to go out hardcore on who at the beginning and just double down on that segmentation and figuring out who loves your product.
Yeah.
The number of times I hear people say, well, I want to do it in North America, even though the traction, go where the traction is.
Totally. Yeah, identify the user type that you think is going to, like you're hypothesizing is the best case, right? I'm pretty sure this tool, I mean, of course there's hypotheses around what you're doing, right? And then you need to prove them out. So the idea is figure out who you think is going to use your product, and then figure out where the hell they are. And it doesn't matter if they're in Mozambique. It doesn't matter where they are, but identify those people and then see if your hypothesis is in fact correct. But focusing on a certain geographic location just because you want to or you live there is unnecessary. And and markets are sophisticated now all over. I mean, in Bangkok, for example, it's an iPhone forward culture. It's not Android, even though that you might think that it's probably like a Samsung town type thing. But so there's these pockets all over that are doing things very similarly to how we would launch a product here. They're just there, wherever that might be.
Comment. One of my advisors a long time ago said, I said something along the lines of, oh my God, like Lululemon, because we were talking about some Lululemon guys, and I said, God, but I don't want Lululemon customers, I said.
Yeah.
And he says, asshole, listen, you would be lucky to have customers. Never mind Lululemon customers. They spend a lot of money.
Yeah.
So stop the arrogance with trying to get American customers if somewhere else is going, right?
Yeah.
Just stop trying to protect what's going on and just say, it's over there, great, I'm going over there.
Yeah.
Right? Whatever, great.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's it. just a quick recap, like your product needs to be excellent. You know, build something amazing and tailor it to a user group. The world is big. There's markets all over, but you're never going to see them until you look. And of course, the world is also super small. You know, reaching out is literally a tweet away. You can identify these people very, very easily by having an intern, you know, just ram through, you know, just do some research. It's very, very simple. Creating community is obviously integral to building any kind of user base anywhere, and empowering the community is critical. This is one of the you know, a real key is like giving people the power, just staying out of their way, giving them the tools that they need to do your work for you, basically. And you know, it's never too early to start, never too late. And of course, this is critical. Overnight success takes years, so just be patient. You know, Pinterest was around for like a year and a half. I mean, yeah, that's still a pretty small cycle, but they took a grassroots approach. They were on the grind in various markets and building their user base, accommodating their core users because they identified who these people are, and then it blew up from there. So, I think this is key, and that's it. Thank you.